Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Victory Farm Center for the Humanities and Cascadia Network's seminar on David Graeber's Debt, the First 5,000 Years. Some of our friends are joining us remotely, and we'll be all introducing ourselves right now. I just wanted to jump up and use the camera to show the room. Hi, everybody. Sometimes we'll have people actually like running this camera and moving it, but right now I don't think we will, unless someone wants to do it while we do this.
You don't see anything in your
So we'll start off with just some introductions. We'll go around and say names, interests, maybe answer some of the questions from the survey that we did this week. So what were some of those questions like? Kind of background level with these various fields, with anthropology, with economics, with political philosophy, with social theory. And we'll all go around and do that. So I'm Dave. Bryan and I live here. This is the center at Victory Farm. And this is a book that I really am excited to read with everyone because I've listened to it on Audible before. And now I'm taking my time actually reading through it. And I'm going to think a lot deeper about it before, because I just ran through it faster before. So I'm really excited that so many other people are joining for this. And I'm curious to hear what got you all interested in this text especially. So we'll just kind of go around.
Hello, I'm Lily. I did the last group. We read the novel 100 Years of Solitude. And so they kind of talked about, hey, we're going to read Debt next. And I was like, I don't know what that is. So I watched the David Graeber Google Talk. So I'm super excited to kind of dive into it a little bit more. Yeah, that's it.
I am Kenneth. I have an interest in systemic issues. This is one of the most trenchant books I've ever read. I hadn't considered debt as a moral issue, a confused moral issue at that, and further, that if you can quantify it, you can commodify it, which leads to a whole other slew of issues. So it's a very trenchant book.
Trenchant. I learned that word from you.
like trenchant warfare. No. I'm Bryan. Like Dave said, I live here alongside him. Yeah, I watched the Graeber lecture he gave about a year ago, and I've wanted to read it ever since. I think, if anything, I'm really interested in questions of ethics and morality, probably more central than anything else. And like Kenneth said, putting debt in under the question mark of morality is really interesting to me. And I'm just curious to see what that looks like and wrestle with it a little bit.
Andrew, and I'm very interested in debt, partially self-interested because I personally have a lot of debt from school and haven't really put a whole lot of thought into like the morals of it, but I'm really excited. I'm excited to kind of do kind of this background. I think it's really cool to have a wide variety of people like Sam, who are like actually like real economist people. So
wouldn't go
like,
that far.
so like we tend to like, especially on the left, we like to talk about those lame mainstream economists, like they make these assumptions, and we like to make fun of them. But I think it'll be important to have some.
Bartering.
Yeah. They just read Adam Smith once, and now they're just like brainwashed. Whatever. It's obviously not 100% true, so I think it'll be good to have some pushback from people who have like gone through like modern schools of economics.
My name is Sky, and I'm really excited to read this book. Dave and I know each other from NSP, which we did. We read other more political texts, and I'm excited to see this. I don't know a lot about economics, so I'm excited to learn more.
My name is Ben, and this seemed like a cool book, so I got the audio book version. And I've been aware of your guys' operations for a while, and it sounded like you had interesting conversations. And so listened to a little bit of the audiobook. I was like, this seems like it's a book I could learn some stuff. It was thought provoking and stuff. So I was like, let's go for it.
Awesome.
I'm Ashley, and I don't have a political background or economics background except for being married to him. And he's really interested in it and talks about it all the time.
I have opinions.
But yeah, I do have a large interest in anthropology. So that's piqued my interest so far in the first 2 chapters. And I like seeing how people, in community deal with things like that. So.
Awesome.
Hello, I'm Chris. I also have an economics background like Sam, but I have a little more interest in the heterodox schools, and so this is kind of an interesting mix of the braver shitting on economists, and then me trying to be like, oh, maybe that's that. So yeah, I'm interested to kind of share my opinions about that and hear everyone else's thoughts on them as well.
It's really exciting. Cool.
Yeah.
My name is Sam. I'm interested in this, I think, foremost from an economics perspective. I graduated a couple semesters ago with a degree in economics, and while I've always harbored an interest in heterodox schools on the left and on the right, but I would probably say that my economic biases tend to be mainstream leavened with other, a random assortment of heterodox insights. So yeah, I'm excited to have some of my assumptions challenged and to yeah.
I wonder if either of you could say a little bit about what you mean by heterodox.
It's schools of economic thought that are not in the mainstream. So that would be on the left, that might be ecological economics, Marxist economics, feminist economics. On the right, Austrian economics.
So just not orthodox, right? It's just like heterodox is just not orthodox.
Right.
Gotcha.
So, there's a reigning school of thought in economics departments around the country. It's not quite as monolithic, I think, as some critics portray it as, but there's definitely an orthodoxy, neoclassical economics, and it has its problems.
Awesome. Cool. And then I'm not sure that you all see one another on the screen the same way, so I'll just call names. And then if you can show yourself, then that would be great. But if you can't, that's all right. But you'll have to unmute your own mic, because if everybody's not muted at the same time, then there's this weird feedback problem. So everybody has to unmute themselves once at a time, basically, and then remute themselves. And one of the things that we try to do with our online friends is make it so that if you have something to say, you can just unmute yourself and interject at any time, and we'll give up the floor to you, because otherwise it's going to be hard to cut in. But also there's a queue system where you can enter into the chat box and say that you'll want to have the floor. But we'll start with April, then Gustav, then Jonathan, then Robert, then Mikey. So April, if you're able to unmute. The questions are name, interests, kind of your background coming into this book, and maybe the questions you have about it. Okay, so April is having mic issues. We'll go to Gustav.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes. Loud and clear.
Great. Okay. So I'm Gustav. I am a PhD student in the History of Science department at Harvard University, and I'll be entering my 4th year in September. My dissertation is on the history of, the history of the relationship between geology and capitalism and governance for about 100 years, between 1750 and, I don't know, 1870 or something like that. Still working out the timeline, but which kind of segues into my interest in this book. So I realized that I needed to know the history of capitalism about only a few months ago, actually, as I was preparing to present my perspectives to my department. I realized, oh my gosh, this is super important. This, this booming literature is really, really helpful and interesting. And so I read as much as I could, and then I realized there was still so much more to read. So I created a list for myself of sort of standard texts in the field, and I included this one. Or by standard texts, I mean things that seem to get cited a lot and talked about a lot. And so I created a list, and I'm working through it, and this one was on it. And then Dave told me he was doing this this working group, and I thought, oh my gosh, well, it's extra,
Barter.
yeah, extra encouragement, and I get to chat with some other people and learn some things from other people too, which is always good. And Dakota?
Oh, hey, I'm Dakota. I'm his girlfriend. I'm starting my PhD in social policy in the fall. So I'm a sociologist by trade, so naturally anthropology is pretty dope. I do a lot of stuff with Marxist thought. So the idea of dismantling ideas around debt and capital is pretty cool to me. So I hopped on in, and actually at time I'm on a political campaign right now. So the fact that I'm here and not doing that is great. So thanks, guys.
And I'll unmute my mic now so the next person can speak.
Thank you. This is really exciting to have you both on board. And then Jonathan Cobb, who's been a Facebook friend for a while now, I think, or at least I've seen him on a lot of Mikey's posts. So it's really cool to have you join us for the first time. Okay, it doesn't work. It doesn't work. That doesn't work. How should we describe it? It sounds like chipmunks right now.
Chipmunks on helium.
Chipmunks on helium. Jonathan, your mic is, I think, messed up. Might be your internet speed, though. Yeah, sounds like helium. I wonder if you have like. Do you have like headphones maybe with like a mic in them that you could like plug into your phone and then use? Something like that. Maybe there could be another microphone source to try, because whatever this is doesn't work. Yeah, no. Doesn't work. Darn technology. No, it still doesn't work. Even then, doesn't work. All right, so we'll have to, Jonathan. We'll try to figure something out. We'll do some kind of technical thing later after the fact. But for now, we'll go to Robert and then Mikey.
All right, I'm Robert. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
I'm not an academic. I'm just a guy. But I am a political leftist, a generic political leftist. I have a lot of anarchism in me, and I'm getting a lot more Marxism in me of late, I suppose. Don't have much experience with anthropology, so I'm really looking forward to dealing with this subject from an anthropological standpoint, just to learn.
Awesome, it's great to have you. Yeah, some of us are friends with Robert through the DSA, and yesterday we were all hanging out at the park because we were doing alternative pride, and that was a really awesome time. How many of you were there for that? Yes, there were like 4 of us there. It was fantastic. So it's good to have you, Robert. Mikey.
Hey, so I'm Mike, here primarily out of my interest in anthropology. I'm glad Jonathan's here. He over the years has really sparked my interest in debt and Graeber's work, so I'm glad he's here for this. And I guess my primary interest is how this can help me expand on what I've learned from Marcel Mauss and Baudrillard on the gift, and see how this plays into debt and everything. So primarily interested in these anthropological insights he's got. It's still messing up, Jonathan. I don't know what the issue is. Maybe it might. If you leave the chat room and you come back in, that might work.
So I'm gonna say really quick. Would you mind moving this around while other people are playing with them? Yeah. Thank you. You delegated by accident by sitting there. Yeah.
Hey, Dave, Jonathan had dropped out of the chat room real quick, and he's going to try to come back in and see if that fixes it.
So I just got back. What happened?
Jonathan is left the chat and he's coming back to see if that'll help get the mic working.
Did you say that twice?
Yes.
Who's Mike?
Mikey, me. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Michael Downs is talking about Jonathan.
Oh,
Yeah,
Jonathan.
Jonathan left the chat.
Oh, I thought you said Dave Jonathan. Okay, I was just confused.
Okay.
Gotcha. Okay.
Let's see if that works.
Because my name's Dave Jonathan on Facebook. My last name is McCarricker. So, no, Jonathan still doesn't work. Darn.
Unfortunate.
All right, we'll have to figure something out for Jonathan's mic later. Really quick, Alton just joined us. So what we were all just doing is, and now we all have to do it again. So I'm just kidding. We're just saying name, interest in reading this book. Kind of maybe a couple things about what you do.
Okay.
Yeah.
Athen, and okay, my name's Athen, and I'm interested in reading this book mostly because Dave told me to, and then I started reading it, and I thought it was pretty interesting as how it sets up how debt is used as a tool to control population. So, and then what interests, what I like to do with myself. Go to school, read. Sometimes I paint, make music. About it.
And Athen is the new financial officer
Oh, that too. I guess I should list that as one of my interests.
of NSP,
Yeah.
which is the partner in this endeavor, actually. So I just shared the syllabus into the Facebook group chat so that anyone who did not have access to that before will be able to look at it while we go over the syllabus. There are a few copies around of the syllabus. If someone hasn't gotten a chance to look at it, maybe you can share with them. What would be really cool is to be able to break up, so we're going to set like the goals of the group and what we're doing in this, endeavor. And then we're going to talk about the ground rules and kind of just the general format, and then we'll be able to jump into the book. And some of us have generated a bunch of questions for these first two chapters, and we'll basically just kind of talk about those. And if you had passages that you're particularly interested in or that you want to talk about, then there'll be time for that. So. The preparation resources, just want to say something about that. How many of you are doing this on Audible using the audiobook? 1, 2, 3. Only 3 of us. Online, Gustav?
You are?
Yes. Well, I'm doing that as well.
Sorry, I forgot I can unmute. Yes, I am.
And he read it to me out loud, so kind of.
That's really cute. Oh, you too? That's great.
Everybody
needs a hobby. All right, so the overarching goal. Our goal is to understand the ways that debt ties us all together and makes this society function, how it relates to morality, the dangers in this, and the opportunities for societal advancement. This will be achieved by a weekly reading regimen and discussions. In so doing, we hope to gain a better understanding of this work, ourselves, and the world. Weekly goal. To be able to state the gist of the week's reading, how it ties into the greater project, and how this relates to our lives. 2, to generate weekly... Jonathan, that microphone is not working. Second weekly goal. To generate weekly questions or points you would like to discuss. That's the part that I'm most excited about, probably. Now, I don't want to read the whole time, so maybe we could all take turns reading off the different ground rules. These have been generated and developed through suggestions and trial and error from previous seminars and philosophy clubs that I've been a part of over the years, and that other groups, other people here have been involved with. And so, yeah. They're a work in progress, and we're always excited to work on them. So always open to suggestions. But for the time being, I'll lead off with the first 2 points, and then other people can kind of just take turns just rotating. We are cultivating a community of critical recognition. More than ever, folks feel isolated or unheard. By committing your attention, putting away the phone, etc., you can help ameliorate this. Recognition, both affirmation and negation, is an essential component of identity formation, community building, and the creative and intellectual projects that produce culture. 2, the necessary conditions for even having a civil discourse as far as we can tell. A, ongoing effort to practice respect, good faith, and benefit of the doubt. Civility is not the absence of conflict, but instead how conflicts are navigated. B, within reason, license must be given for differences, disagreement, and critique, while committing the time and energy for active listening, learning, and discovering shared values and concerns.
3, generous readings precede criticism with both the text as well as with comrades. We try to maintain critical interpretations alongside the generous read.
4, respect alterity. Assume the other is not reducible to a stereotypical character and give the benefit of the doubt. Our tendency is to pigeonhole others in the ideas we have of the ideas they express. Fight this tendency.
5, try not to interrupt. 6, be aware of the space you take up when you do speak, so that if you're speaking substantially more than others, then you can try to step back more often so others can step forward. 7, this is free and open to the public. All that we ask is a serious commitment of time, energy to reading this text, and that you come to discussions prepared with questions, or at least questioning the earnestness of a listener. Questioning with the earnestness of a listener.
Of a learner, yes.
And listener.
Thank you. Analyst. Yes.
A, if we are at a point where several people are trying to talk at once, which is rare but does happen, and you wish to get your piece in without having to struggle for the space to do so, then there are signals you can use with the facilitator. Make a fist to be added to the queue to hold the floor for a few minutes. 2 fingers adds you to quick response queue to address what is being said. 1 finger for a quick clarification. Is that the right finger? I don't know.
Roles. So I'm Dave Jonathan McCarricker. I'm responsible for ensuring the participants respect that participants respect the ground rules, that all voices are heard, and coordinating intros and special talks each week. So that we'll talk about that in a second. Send me personal messages if you want to suggest changes or pose anonymous questions that I can then share out with people later, or that can be added to the survey, which a lot of you did the survey for this. We don't have quizzes or essays or any of that junk, but like we do want to be able to like practice talking about and thinking about what we're doing here at the meta level as a group, as a community, as independent scholars and researchers, but also be able to like read people's responses to questions about the text, right? About important points in the text. And it's almost like a message board. It's almost like an exam or a quiz online, but it's really just a survey, and everyone's able to see the results, which is really cool to like read through everybody's answers for these things. So to everyone who did contribute to that, thank you. And I hope everyone else will continue to, and that if you have questions that you want to see on there, you want to see other people responding to them, either anonymously or not, just let's feed those into this, because I think that will like add a really cool component to the whole seminar. Teachers and discussion leads. A few of us are collaboratively taking turns unpacking sections and ideas within this text. So for instance, I know Mikey is considering a way to like bring in some Nietzsche, talking about the genealogy of morals, to explain some of the stuff going on here, because Graeber does kind of draw from Nietzsche somewhat. And I know that he'll probably want to do some stuff with Baudrillard at some point. Jonathan has a lot of experience in this, and if we can get his mic to work, then he'll be able to hopefully also be leading off some of these sessions, maybe if you would want to. Gustav, I've already talked to you about kind of tracking the kind of historical claims and interpretations that Graeber's using here, and like as someone who studies history, being able to tell us how full of shit Graeber might be sometimes, and then or maybe not. You'll say this is quality work, and who knows? But we look forward to hearing that kind of stuff as well. And so we'll all be kind of developing our mini talks to like lead these things off with, hopefully. Some people won't want to do that, but a lot of people will. And so just like, we'll be generating a list of people who will be doing that. So make sure to just like in the next survey, say that you want to do it. Jacob's not with us right now, but he'll also be doing some of these. He'll probably lead off the next one. A lot of people couldn't make it today because it is Father's Day. But we're all doing this because Benjamin's a father. And so this is
my Father's Day.
This is our Father's Day present to you. Yeah. Then we've got some questions that we'll be asking that are on the syllabus. The syllabus is a living document. It can be added to. So we'll kind of be adding to these questions to be thinking about throughout the entire reading. Like one of the questions is like how are we to understand David Graeber's anarchism? How does anarchy as a theoretical position reveal insights into life that we might not otherwise have seen? And are there necessary blind spots that come with this? And what are those? It's just an open set of questions. We have people here from all across the political spectrum. And so it's going to be really cool seeing what comes out of this. Would anybody like to lead off with any reflection on their reading of the text so far, or questions that they want to pose to the group? Online, you can jump right in anytime too. We'll do the cute thing if we start to pile up, but for now, let's just go around and talk freely about it, like we're just hanging out. And Sam, if you want to talk, I'll actually grab the camera and like turn it.
Oh, okay.
Because I want you in the game.
I think it makes sense at some point to go over those on page 13, where he talks about as the essential questions of the book.
That's a great idea.
That I think could start a good discussion. So it's, here's the central question of this book. What precisely does it mean to say that our sense of morality and justice is reduced to the language of a business deal? What does it mean when we reduce moral obligations to debts? What changes when the one turns into the other? And how do we speak about them when our language has been so shaped by the market? Anyone have some answers?
I almost want to just keep reading it.
Yeah.
Well, it might be a little hard to discuss some of these because go through all of those questions in the subsequent chapters.
Right. But yeah, no, but this is a perfect section for setting the stage for like even what this book is about, right?
Mm-hmm.
I like that, when this opens up with the story when he's at this cocktail party and this woman approaches him and no, he's introduced to this woman. I like how that whole story sets up pretty much the whole book, like the questions that are going to be asked, right? And the reason is because we have like these average everyday conversations with people, and there are just all these assumptions, moral and political in nature, built into these conversations, and people don't even realize how many assumptions are even in there.
Yeah, that's spot on. I mean, if everything is framed in terms of a business deal, of a transaction, that could be a zero-sum game. Not necessarily, but that's one plank in that framework.
I think, okay, so speaking of like this cocktail party, I think one of the other key passages in the first chapter is on page 5 at the top paragraph here, which is him he's been reflecting for a few weeks on that encounter at the cocktail party. It's like the very fact that we don't know what debt is, the very flexibility of the concept is the basis of its power. If history shows anything, It is that there's no better way to justify relations founded on violence, to make such relations seem moral, than by reframing them in the language of debt. Above all, because it immediately makes it seem that it's the victim who's doing something wrong. Mafiosi understand this. So do the commanders of conquering armies. For thousands of years, violent men have been able to tell their victims that those victims owe them something. If nothing else, they owe them their lives, a telling phrase because they haven't been killed. I know that Mikey's thought a lot about debt recently. I'm just like wondering if you'd want to talk about why you've already been thinking about debt.
Well, for me, what I like so far about this book is that it's getting at something I've been thinking about, and it comes out of Nietzsche, but it also comes out of Deleuze and Guattari, because they have a lot to say about debt in Anti-Oedipus. I wish that what they had to say about debt was more accessible, but what I've been able to glean from it, I think, is really important. And I think right here we're getting at something where I think on a basic kind of reflex interpretation, if you ask people what debt is, they're going to primarily say it's an economic thing, right? When in fact, we find that, it has this basis in morality. On some level, you could say, theology is rooted in it, ontology is rooted in it, and it has a much more pervasive presence than is normally thought of. And so that's kind of how I'm approaching it. I'm trying to see debt in all of these little spots in the social order that normally you wouldn't think of debt being there, and trying to think through all of that.
I think this is what they're talking about when they talk about the language of debt. So I'm interested in how language is used in certain communities to not only the meaning of the words themselves, but the word choice has an impact and has a meaning. So later on page 16, there's this little section about how terms like reckoning or redemption are most obvious. They're taken directly from the language of ancient finance. And then in a larger sense, the same can be said of guilt, freedom, forgiveness, and sin. Arguments about who really owes what to whom play a central role in shaping our basic vocabulary of right and wrong. So that's kind of goes back to what he was talking about with how debt is kind of tied into systems that you don't expect it to be. I just thought that was interesting.
Could anyone else find that on page 16?
Not on 16.
It's on page 8.
It's 16 on the PDF I'm reading.
Oh, it's on page 8.
But it's page 8 in the actual.
Oh, okay. Yeah, no, this is
So
an
it's-
awesome
Yeah.
passage.
Yeah.
I was just like, what? Where?
Yeah. Okay, we clarified that now. A little late.
Yeah, one of the things I'm going to be really interested in is, this is an interrogation through anthropology of the development of debt through, especially the market and the state. But it's also, there's also this thing about religion in here, right? There's a sense in which we think about debt religiously. Can anyone talk about debt and religion or guilt and their personal experiences with it, or just theoretically,
I think
how this is implicated?
I would say at the very least, within the Christian tradition, there's a concept of sin creating a debt, and there we go, that Christ redeems people from the debt of sin. So the language is very explicit in the Christian tradition. There's also time. I think they talk about it in the book, but there's stuff around forgiveness of debts, year of jubilee, and that kind of stuff. But I think that the central story of the Christian tradition is there is sin and a debt that's incurred because of it, and the debt has to be paid. And normally the way that you pay it is through some sort of animal sacrifice, maybe doing good stuff. There's some way to repay it. But then the figure of Christ is the one who ultimately pays and redeems and cancels out all the debts. Mm-hmm. So it's definitely tied up in that language.
You're born with an original sin, which is an original, you're born as in debt to the world. And the word jubilee and jubilation is used a lot in Christianity to talk about.
Yeah. Yeah, there's the traditional, I think it's every 40 years or 50 years, where in their system of their social system, and they basically reset everything. Everything went back to their forefathers' lands, and the lands all reset and everything. So the debts were forgiven and stuff.
I just think that concept is funny too, because like you said, you're born with that original sin, and then you're indebted to your religion, to Christ, you know, for the rest of your life. You have to continue to repay and live virtuously.
Because you're, sin nature, because Adam and Eve, right? And so now you're marked with this debt.
Primordial debt.
Primordial debt,
yeah. And I'd say that's true, but there's also, I think that there's the counterbalance of, that is the theological wedge, but there's also the fact that in practical terms, everybody commits what Christians would say is sin. So I think it's a little bit of both.
Right, and yet the Catholic Church, in a historical sense, according to the text, is traditional. It's has been classically they forbid the practice of lending money at interest. So if it's something monetary, then that seems to be a no-go. But if it's like a moral obligation or a moral debt, then it's different. So then later on here, I like this story that they tell about there's a famous or influential debtor who dies, and then his friends plead with the church and say, can we please have him buried, let's see, in in a cemetery near the church. And the priest said, let us put his body on a donkey and see God's will. And then he goes out and takes him to where the thieves are hanged. So,
and throw him in a giant pile of crap.
Yeah.
On top of it, right?
Sweet. So Dakota has something, and so we're doing a little cue now, so people can start.
Hey, so it's kind of harkening back a little bit, but I think I'm coming from a Marxist lens, like I said, and so what I really like about that particular passage on page 5 is about how it inherently means violence, because there's this binary opposition that's being created where debt is inherently this debt and then debtor, and there's a relationship there. And so I think when we talk about debt, we're talking about systems of inequality and inequity and statuses of oppression. And I found that was really interesting in actually interrogating the idea of debt and how it relates to structural inequality. So I was just fascinated by that, but it's kind of late thought now.
Awesome. No, that's really cool. But I'm sure there's some people here who aren't that well acquainted with what it even means to be using a Marxist lens. I'm wondering if you can elaborate on that just a little bit. I actually am as well. It's actually something I'm really interested in, right? Because he said, he basically referred to the labor theory of value not being a thing, right? And saying that had been disproved in the case of Smith, but it insinuates Marx as well, and that's what Graeber said. And so I'm interested in how Graeber is thinking about things like that, right?
Yeah. So I guess what I mean when I say I'm coming from a Marxist lens is the idea of have and have-nots. They're relationships of power built within a structure. So in Marx talks about the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, and I won't get too technical, but basically the proletariat are oppressed and they don't have the means of production, which are ways of acquiring wealth, and the bourgeoisie do. And so I kind of am looking at it from that lens of the bourgeoisie would be the people giving the debts, giving out the money, and the people without the money would be the ones having the debts. So it lends itself well to that theory of societal formation and conflict, I guess, if that makes sense.
Cool. I guess I'll be the connection, the text guy. But on page 9, it's, I believe, and throughout the entire book, that the relationship between debt and debtor, at least from what I've read so far, is described as is framed as a class system, as a relationship between the haves and the have-nots. So here, there's this Himalayan society on page 9, where it kind of mirrors the capitalist labor system in the sense that the people are so poor that they have to indebt themselves to a wealthy master and get money from them, get these loans, and then they have to work it off for the rest of their lives because that's the only payment they can give.
So Andrew had a quick.
Oh, I was so you brought up a bit about the Catholic Church and their forbidding of lending out at interest, but it just sort of reminded me of like sin and then also indulgences that have to be paid and the.
Or your grandpa won't go to
Yeah, but just thinking of that as actually like you're actually physically repaying debts using real money, and that's a conversion of money into moral. It's like a direct conversion of money to moral obligation.
I was thinking of that. And really quick, Jonathan wanted to try out his new mic settings.
Okay, is this any better? Or am I gonna give up?
The bass is back.
Glad to have you with us now. Would you like to, you could say a couple things about yourself and then some of your thoughts on what's been said so far or something else you want to bring into the conversation? You're muted right now, though.
Okay, so I'm Jonathan. My degree is in sociology and anthropology. They were a combined department in my college. I came into this initially from a heterodox economics perspective. I was reading upon a similar economic theory called modern monetary theory, which dovetails with a lot of the stuff he's saying in here about how taxation creates monetary value and the like. I actually read this book back in 2011 while Occupy Wall Street was going on, and so I was participating in the Occupy movement while also reading this book, and of course Dave Gray was also involved in the Occupy movement as well. So he kind of doubly influenced me in this very radicalizing way at the time. And so anyway, like my interests coming into this have a lot to do with philosophy, economics, and social justice. And based on what's been said so far, I think one thing I want to add is I think what's interesting. I mean, he talks about the morality of debt. I think what is very easy to miss for a lot of people is that he's actually not saying that debt is inherently a bad thing, because he talks a lot about these like mutual aid societies. Like as a Mosian, the sense of people's mutual indebtedness to each other is actually like a sort of social glue that brings society together. And it's when debts become like exact and you have to extract an exact price on them that it becomes a tool of oppression and something exploitative. So.
Thank you.
Hey, Jonathan, just to add a little bit here. So is that one of the reasons that he appreciates Marcel Mauss and the gift? Because those economies, yes, there is a form of indebtedness, but like how Baudrillard talks about, it's not like a quantitative system of equivalence is laid over those exchanges. And because of that, there's still a kind of free play at work there where, like you say, that precision of the debt can't really be marked or calibrated. And I could see that's why he likes the gift economy and stuff like that. Is that right?
Right. And in fact, I think what's really instructive, it's if you want to read it on your own, like I've read some of his other books. One of his books, I think it was his thesis, is called Toward an Anthropological Theory of Value, where he sort of synthesizes Mauss and Marx in terms of creating a theory of value that can be applied across different societies that don't have these capitalist markets. And one thing like Mauss was really emphatic about, like the idea that of like emphasizing gift versus exchange. But what he says in this toward the anthropological theory of value is that in a sense it doesn't really matter whether you're using gift or exchange as a basis. If you're making an exact account of things, it's still the same system. It's when it provides a social glue is when there's a system of where the debt is never really paid off, where you always give a little more and they give a little more, and so so there's no keeping track of exactly how much anyone owes. It's just, hey, I do you a favor, you do me a favor. We're gonna support each other.
Thanks, that helps.
Yeah, it's interesting, you know, because you can be in a living situation where it's just kind of like there's certain things that are just you just give a little more, right? And it would get weird if all of a sudden you were like, hey, I think you're using more toilet paper than I am, right? Like there's just certain things that we just let go, right? Like that. But
I don't ever let that go. 4 squares.
Yeah, I say even in those systems, it seems like there's not a precise keeping track. I think it may be the precision and the quantification that makes the difference. There still is certain rules over the type of, you know, gifts in return that you would give to somebody else when they help you out. You know, you're not gonna. I mean, it's gonna be potatoes for eggs or something. Things that are close in value, but you can't always quantify it precisely. And I think. See, Ashley and I were talking last night about this a little bit, and this kind of helped me because I was thinking about like some of his central questions, you know, like how the language of morality is reduced to a business deal. I was getting a little bit, I think I was maybe confused or whatever, I don't know if that's the right word, but basically it seemed like that made it sound like he was saying the impermissible move was taking up language of morality that we have right now and turning that into the language of a business deal. When really the impermissible move is from the language of debt or obligation at a base moral sense that he illustrates as existing in a lot of societies, and turning that into a precise monetary debt. So it's that first move that's the impermissible move. Whereas debt and obligation are things that pre-existed monetary systems, at least according to him. Well, you can have debt and obligation, although he uses them a little more precisely without a monetary system and precision, all that. Then we got a new person here, so.
Welcome, Robert. We'll just let you wave hi. Sorry, so yeah.
That was it.
That was great.
That was it.
That was
Sorry,
great.
It was just, yeah.
Hey, Dave, you know, I can't help but think of that. So it does seem like there's this certain violence of quantification, right? I mean, think about the conversations you and I have had on the phone. Think if we quantify it and say, okay, Dave, I let you talk for 5 minutes. Now you have to let me talk for 5 minutes, right? It just totally, in a sense, breaks apart the bond of the indebtedness we each have to each other in a conversation. And you could think about it like just in something basic like that, a conversation. Of course, there's indebtedness involved in somebody expressing something, then you return the gift, so to speak. But that type of indebtedness, it's calculated on a kind of implicit level. Like, I'm no fan of utilitarianism at all, but the idea of hedonic calculus, that we're always doing a kind of implicit calculation, I think there is something to that. And I think we can see that with the idea of indebtedness. But when you try to explicitly quantify it, there's something about the quantification itself that poisons it.
Like it's a self-fulfilling prophecy that the person is going to lose your trust, right?
Or that the value
it's so mechanistic, right? It somehow it turns the conversation, if we use the example of the conversation, it just turns it into like some sort of equipment or mechanism, dehumans it in some sense.
Right, yeah, like you each get 2 minutes, tit for tat, right? And you're mid-thought, your 2 minutes is up, shut up, Michael's turn. And then he's, like, yeah, that's not a real conversation, we all know it. What's interesting, just to think about that, the thought experiment a little more is like, it can also go into the realm where one person is obviously taking more than the other person, or like, quote unquote, maybe more indebted in some way. And then the other person would go, look, I do all of this stuff. I'm always the one talking. You never like respond. And I just feel like I'm talking to an empty phone here. What's up with that? Right? Like there's just like this level where it's not a purely detailed list of exactly how many minutes it was, how many words and sentences that you might have said, but strictly, yeah, the balance has shifted too much, and now let's get it back to a square one. But what's hard for me right now is like we're only 2 chapters in, and it's like, where are we going with this? I'm like, why is this? My question is sort of, why is he debunking the barter thing in the first place, right? Like, what role is that going to play in this whole conversation? Other than maybe what we're now getting to is like, okay, if just thinking about indebtedness is more originary than like, oh, we just trade this for that, and it's actually more of this just like natural social thing to, I have this, and then like, oh, you know, I gave you some chickens 6 months ago, and now I'm hungry. You got potatoes, right? But it hasn't gone anywhere yet, so it's like interesting to think like, what would, you know, what's going to come up next, and how's that playing into this whole thing? Because right now it's just we've been introduced to some ideas, and I'm like, I don't know.
Yeah, this is a nice lead into a passage that I wanted to make sure that we all touched on. And there will be lots of passages that I hope everyone else has that they want to make sure that we touch on as well. But this one is directly related to the question, like, why does it matter? Well, okay, so he's, you know, doing this anthropological deconstruction of orthodox neoliberal economics. Okay, but why does he have to go after the myth of barter? And one of the interesting questions that I'm going to be wondering from like you two especially is like, is this myth of barter so foundational? Does it actually matter? Right. Okay. But so we'll begin on 32, but most of this is on page 33. This is basically the section where he's saying like, this is why this has to come down. This is the problem with it. I think that's what this passage was. So recall here the language of the economics textbooks. This is the bottom of 32. Imagine a society without money. Imagine a barter economy. One thing these examples make abundantly clear is just how limited the imaginative powers of most economists turn out to be, right? This is right after talking about some of the more elaborate ways of exchanging goods and services that, you know, involve partying and sex and all sorts of fun things. Why? The simple answer would be, for there to even be a discipline called economics, a discipline that concerns itself first and foremost with how individuals seek the most advantageous arrangement for the exchange of shoes for potatoes or cloth for spears, it must assume that the exchange of such goods need have nothing to do with war, passion, adventure, mystery, sex, or death. Economics assumes a division between different spheres of human behavior that, among people like the Gungwingu and the Nambikwara, simply does not exist. These divisions, in turn, are made possible by very specific institutional arrangements, the existence of lawyers, prisons, and police, to ensure that even people who don't like each other very much, who have no interest in developing any kind of ongoing relationship, but are simply interested in getting their hands on as much of the other's possessions as possible, will nonetheless refrain from the most obvious expedient, theft. This in turn allows us to assume that life is neatly divided between the marketplace, where we do our shopping, and the sphere of consumption, where we concern ourselves with music, feasts, and seduction. In other words, the vision of the world that forms the basis of the economics textbooks, which Adam Smith played so large a part in promulgating, has by now become so much a part of our common sense that we find it hard to imagine any other possible arrangement. And I'm like heavily underlining the word common sense here because this is the element. So some people have not studied a lot of, say, political philosophy or maybe social theory or something like that. And, you know, some people have expressed that in the survey. One of the key aspects of critical theory and social theory and political philosophy is the project of interrogating and undermining systems of oppression and exploitation, but also ideology and dogmatism as fundamental mechanisms that allow systems of exploitation and oppression to even exist in the first place. So common sense is always suspect here, right? For any deconstructive sort of project like this, common sense is, what is common sense? What are our common sense assumptions about gender and sex, for instance, or about the relation of the commodity to human labor, or you know, these or of the unconscious to the conscious. Like these tend to be the kinds of methodological moves that are done to put common sense notions like under question to make them suspicious. Yeah. So who wants to pile in with something?
Well, I personally just love how I like how he points out the issue with economics, and that's I think that's kind of what he's starting to build up here. You know, Dave kind of was talking about Dave. I'm
Dave.
Idiot. Bryan.
Oh.
I'm sorry, I'm just saying random words now. It's been a long day.
Bryan.
Is what he was saying, you know, where's this going? And I think that we kind of get the glimpses of it in this passage, that he's kind of going for this broad critique of structures, especially saying that, like, he definitely wants to trace where our modern systems come from. And I think he really wants to do it through looking at debt, because, you know, he plainly says it, like, the reason why lawyers and laws exist is because if Dave owes me money and doesn't want to pay, I need to get that back somehow. Mm-hmm. And so the idea of these arrangements focuses on that. And so but I think what's really interesting when he gets into the economic critique is he basically says that, you know, economics is like trying to pretend like these are two different spheres. Like there's living and then there's the marketplace. You know, like, you know, consumption has nothing to do with the marketplace and the marketplace has nothing to do with consumption other than they feed each other. When in reality, that's simply not true. But as someone who had to take a high school economics class recently, it's very much treated as these magical systems that are apart from each other and are perfectly understandable. You know, I always loved it when my economics teacher would tell me, well, the first assumption you make in any economic model is that people are being reasonable, which is, if your mode of study relies on people being reasonable, you're kind of shooting yourself in the foot already. And so I think that in undermining what we see as common sense, he allows us to start viewing the issue from I think in reality, what he's really trying to do is get us out of the current ideology and giving us ways to get out of it. Because it's really easy to say, like, oh, I don't agree with neoliberalism. Like, I don't agree with austerity. I don't agree with all that. But what do we do instead? What does that look like? And, you know, what the hell am I doing? Are a lot harder questions to answer. And I think that really is Graeber's intention throughout this book, is to give us this anthropological study, to give us the tools to exist outside common sense and the current ideology.
Oh, solid. Hey, do you want to also introduce yourself really quick?
Yeah, sorry, I'm Robert. I completely got the time wrong. I thought it was 7, like the Hegel discussion. Luckily, I noticed that there were a lot of links going up, and I checked the time again, and I rushed over again.
Nice. Good to have you. I was worried. I was like, wait, is Robert not doing this now?
I feel like I want to say something about this. So, I don't know if I buy the notion that he entirely undermines like the founding myth of economics with this, but at the very least, I think what he does is he kind of circumscribes its scope a little bit, and he says you have to make a few assumptions if you're going to do economics. And actually, for our modern economics, I would say whether you're talking about orthodox or heterodox school, is it's a modern world. They're dealing with a modern world that uses money as a medium of exchange and debt and all that kind of stuff. So you're already scoping things down. I don't think economics is going to have a lot to say about these other ways of doing exchange and debt and that kind of stuff. Or at least it's not going to be a very well-developed field. The more where it's well-developed and where it has the most to say is in a world where there's money, essentially. But at the same time, like it's more of a mainstream economic idea that you have to assume that people are reasonable when doing economics. I mean, at least at least one of the heterodox schools, its assumption is basically like people are trying to accomplish things in life for whatever it is. They've got goals, they've got things they want to get done, and they also have a concept of how the world works in order to get those things done. And that the way that world works can include the social structure of other people around you and how you navigate that social structure and people are going to react in order to accomplish your goals. And those goals don't have to be selfish. They don't have to be self-interested. They could be for family, for community, for tribe, or for whatever. So I think that his critique of economics would be on point, but it would kind of hit more of a narrow conception of economics that's only interested in, like he said, exchange of shoes for potatoes, but not in a broader sense of it's an examination of how human beings use, essentially means to reach ends stuff. If that makes sense. So I like his critique, but I don't think it's a devastating blow to the whole enterprise.
To orthodox economics in general.
Orthodox, or especially orthodox to some extent, but more some of the heterodox schools like the Austrian or Misesian part of the Austrian school. And these guys will probably tell you more about that because they probably know more about it than I do. I'm a mere dilettante, so I'm tagging you guys in.
I was about to take you in anyway.
Were you? All right. Well, I think that what Graeber does is he does bring an anthropological perspective to this. He's got real world examples of how economic systems have functioned. But I don't think it's devastating to mainstream economics because, and this is really where his attitude bugs me a little bit. He overplays his hands when he claims to just eviscerate modern economics as if economists, however you think of them ideologically, are typically fairly smart people, that they believe in this fairy tale that's never been borne out by the evidence. But I think the barter explanation is, I don't know how Adam Smith and Carl Menger actually thought about it, but for most economists, it's more about the logic of how monetary systems develop. It's a thought experiment. If you're in philosophy, that thought experiments are a pretty big deal. Economists use them a lot too, because it's hard to try and isolate variables when you're dealing with humans. So I don't know. I've got a lot that I want to say here. So the explanation that I'm most familiar with Carl Menger, who was an Austrian economist in the 1870s and 1880s, and he kind of used Smith and then extended Smith's insights into into the study of money. And what he's trying to explain is why, or one of the things he's trying to explain is, why is gold and silver? Why has that usually been a form of money? What are the conditions that lead to that? Well, most of the time, for medium exchange, it needs to have some use value outside of just being a medium exchange. It needs to be divisible, easily divisible. It needs to be durable, and there are all sorts of items that can fit that criterion, but it tends to be gold and silver. And I think when you look around throughout history, gold and silver has typically been the medium exchange. And Graeber even, in a way, proves that point with the Sumerian example, where silver is, in some sense, like a bedrock monetary unit. So I don't know how much sense that made. But yeah, I think it's not as devastating a critique as he wants it to be. But it is his anthropological insights. I think economists should incorporate them.
Well, I'm not in this to disprove an Austrian philosopher or an Austrian economist I've never read, but I don't think that we can say gold and silver have been, because there's a lot of evidence that they haven't. Because it's a very Eurocentric view to simply say that gold and silver have been the mediums of exchange, because most of the world hasn't used gold and silver. The Native Americans didn't use it in the North and South, other than distinct tribes. And it's definitely been used. but there have been thousands of other materials used. I mean, there's a tribe in Indonesia which used stone wheels. And it was literally just, they just knew who owned wheels. There was even a wheel that fell in the ocean, and they decided that they still owned it. But, you know, if you look at it, it's really just kind of a traceable line of trade routes that use gold and silver because that's centered around Europe. You know, the Silk Road used gold and silver, but once again, that was a European trade route that was, you know, of course, there's also the Middle East, but I'm saying that it's all kind of connected to Europe, where you see the use of gold and silver, and that's because gold and silver is very prominent in Europe and the surrounding countries, and was more exploited than it was in many other places. And so I think that Graeber's point, and I'm actually going to defend that Graeber's point is as dedicated as he's making it, is that all we have really are thought experiments. And that just doesn't match the evidence. And, you know, you brought up how thought experiments are important in philosophy, but a lot of philosophers go against the use of thought experiments because they argue that it basically, it basically doesn't really encapsulate anything, is essentially the critique of thought experiments. And so I think that's Graeber's point. And I don't think he's going for burning economists and proving them all wrong. But I think he's saying I'm doing this great big thing just because he's challenging the ruling ideology.
I think you can say at least just that, if anything, that if it doesn't completely undermine orthodox economics, what it does is it adds that you can't do orthodox economics without also doing ethics, right? Like that it is morally embedded in that all this stuff with empire and genocide and all these things are fully implicated by economics, and that we can't do economics without paying attention to the externalities, right?
And I think though that I think the undermining comes in the fact that he is challenging it, because economics is not challenged. You know, there are different schools, but economics was, you know, there was never a point where I could ask, you know, why am I being taught these systems when I was in high school? Because, and I think that's Graeber's attempt and that's why I think that that's why I'm willing to defend that he is doing something very important here. And I would even say vital, and because he's challenging our view of economics. And even if his critique isn't full, even if there's still more that could be added, even if he's not totally disproving it, challenging it is a hell of a thing. And a lot of people will write you off just for challenging economics. And so I think that's his mission, and I think that's why he thinks that he's doing a lot.
There's an interesting footnote. In this regard, 452, number 15.
452?
Yeah, 452.
Number 15.
Speaking of ethics, one historian remarks, by the close of the 16th century, bullion, primarily silver, made up over 95% of all exports leaving Spanish America for Europe. Nearly that same percentage of the indigenous population had been destroyed in the process of seizing these riches. So, an unexamined ethical component. And I haven't considered giving gold and silver as units of currency that drives the mining industry. From, I believe, Roman times primarily onwards.
Interesting. Oh, and really, so I think you've got a quick reply, but also Gustav's been sitting on a quick reply for a little bit here.
Hi. Okay, I had to find the unmute. So I just a general comment about the long passage that Dave quoted out, which I agree. That's I think that's definitely the crux of his argument in that chapter for sure. I'm glad you read it out in full. I just wanted to say that the specific institutional arrangements that he talks about there, the lawyers, the prisons, and police. Something I appreciated about his argument in this chapter, that those specific arrangements, they not only enable the division that he's trying to highlight between economics and everything else. But they also limit our imagination. I think he does this very well. I think it's really insightful because it's this historical specificity, by really focusing on these institutional arrangements that allows him to reveal economic history, to show it to be actually this long-standing, thought experiment. And it allows him to show how economists are. I mean, another way, a nicer way of putting it. He's very kind of in your face about it, and that's fine. I appreciate that. A nicer way to put it, I guess, would be to say he's showing how economists are relying too much on familiar structures in their reconstruction of historical situations, and that's a very typical historical critique. To pull out of his toolbox to show that that historians are making this sort of Whiggish presentist assumptions. And in this case, it's a big one, right? And I read through that chapter and I thought that was really nice, and he did that very well. So it's an appreciative comment. Quickly, that was my earlier comment, but as the conversation progressed, I also wanted to say quickly is on gold and silver, which is something I've been reading a lot about. I find it fascinating. And one thing I noticed as I read through chapter 2 is he doesn't talk almost at all about how gold and silver came to be used. I mean, he focuses a lot on the physical properties and why that led it to be used, as I forget who mentioned that, but he does talk about that, but he doesn't really talk about the specific power structures and historical processes that move these substances out of the earth, such as by the Iberian Empire, and then into these global markets propelled and dominated by, Asian markets for over 500 years with Europe as middlemen. And I don't think that undermines anything. It's just a curious absence, and I thought I'd point it out. Thank you.
So you like how he's doing this overall, but there's like that one point that's kind of interesting that it's not there. I think that maybe someone else who's already read this as well will be able to confirm this. I think he does do this. He does get into that.
Okay.
But yeah.
I look forward to it then.
Real quick point. In response to you. So where trade has happened with a great deal of frequency and over long spans of many miles of words down there right now. You've seen gold and silver because, again, they're easily divisible. They are durable, and typically they're used for jewelry, so there's some external value there. So it's not just Europe; it was Asia too. And where trade has really taken off, that tends to be the currency that's used, not just for because of power, but because there's an actual utility there. But you're right. I mean, there have been lots of different monetary units. It's just that most of these cases involve tribal exchange or exchange between tribes who are in close proximity to one another. Now, one thing that Graeber says, not in the book, but in an interview I saw, that I think is interesting. So in the Sumerian example that he points out, one of the things that the temple, that the priests used the silver that was stored in the temple for, was actually to trade with foreigners. Because again, it's lots of goods that you could use for money will spoil if you're traveling thousands of miles over the desert.
I don't want to dominate and I don't want to pin this into debate, but I would just add that the one system, though, where we really do see trade occur over long distances, that only over the map, it gets kind of hard to say what's cultural because we're crossing so many cultures. But I will add, it's really only one trade system that uses gold and silver reliably, and that's the one centered around the Middle East and the Silk Road. That's just a really massive trade network. And it's a lot of the world, but I think if you look at other trade networks, they don't necessarily do that. A lot of that's because they were tribal and there wasn't as much in trading. So, we can't really say how history would have turned out, but all I'm going to add is that it's just one trade system is really all that's the only one that gets that big. But all we really have is one example of gold and silver being used just over such a massive amount and over so many cultures. but it's all dependent on one trade system. Even down from the Mali Empire, where it managed to crash an entire economy because they brought so much gold on his Hajj. All the way to the Silk Road, that was all connected by one trade network. So I think that we can say that's a standard currency there.
This all just adds to what's being said, right? Like this is within the scope of what he's saying, right? This isn't even like a problem for Orthodox or heterodox, right? Like it's. I guess I'm trying to understand exactly how it pertains to.
Well, how it pertains, at least where I think Graeber goes wrong. Not that he's not adding insight here, but that he argues that. Just completely lost my train of thought.
No. Well, the thing is like it's a complex point, and I think that like we're gonna have to like trace this as we develop through. It's not like that's one of the things is we're all gonna have to be kind of tracing this line of thought through the book. So we have to be able to articulate the question in a few different ways. And I know Jonathan's on the queue. But let's really quick to you, and then we'll go to
maybe a clarification.
Because I think we're about to switch.
So we kind of spun off into gold and silver versus other types of monetary units. But isn't the issue more a monetary unit of any kind versus and the backdrop of simultaneous barter, and that being the founding myth of modern economics and stuff? So I guess my question generally is on that is. Okay, so he has this nice paragraph, and some of his critiques might be right, but how if okay, he's right. There wasn't barter that happened at the same time. How does that undermine economics rather than just saying economists need to do a little go back and recheck their story? Because really, these gift economies are barter systems. They're debt-based barter systems. They're just not simultaneous, barter systems the way he talks about and stuff. So it seems like it tweaks the story. And I don't know how it seems like that might get back down below the gold and silver.
Did you want to?
Well, we've got someone on the queue.
Oh yeah. We'll go to the online queue, and then we'll come back here in a second.
Okay, so as far as the barter economy and whether that's devastating to economists, I think that it's actually illustrative of a major tendency in economics and philosophy and a lot of thought since the Enlightenment, which is to portray things in these very isolated individualistic terms. Economists' favorite thought experiments almost tend to evolve Robinson Crusoe above everyone else, right? Someone who's stranded from all of society and then suddenly starts trading with someone else, which of course is not how society actually develops. And he's saying, well, let's start from society. Let's actually start from a community of people who know each other and are actually interacting with each other on a common day. And they exchange goods and services as an extension of their other social relationships. So I think that is an essential point to point out that economics is not separate from other social spheres of life. As far as the trade routes involving gold and silver, I think there's an interesting point when he gets to barter in exchange, like that. You exchange with people who you don't exactly trust, right? So outsiders, he talks about like some of the ritualized forms of barter that develop in these tribal societies. They don't barter within their society. They barter with outsiders, and there you have to actually worry about exactitude and getting like an equal exchange, which I actually think about that in terms of my work. I work in at a nonprofit and social services and stuff, and my workplace is unionized, right? So, and there's this game a lot of nonprofits play of like, the CEOs of these companies are always like, oh, we really care about you, we're trying to like fight for you and all that stuff, and but don't you worry about unionizing, we're gonna take care of you, that sort of thing. But we unionize because we need that voice in order to enter this exchange relationship with them and be able to actually demand an exact price of saying, yes, we need wages to be this much, we need these benefits, and actually laying out exactly like what is on the table. And so that's not a gift economy. That is an exchange relationship of exactitude, because it's two people who don't trust each other, because the workers can't trust the employers, and so we have to have this exchange. So anyway, I think that whole barter thing, it's this fallacy of thing that you can simplify human relationships to by starting from the individual and then not assuming any relationships between the people who are involved. Which I think, it doesn't overturn all of economics, but it does turn our attention away from a certain kind of economics and towards a new way of doing it.
Okay, Gustav's saying he'll have to leave at 6:30. What, our time? Sorry. Okay. Right, because we started at 5. So he's gonna have to leave in a couple of minutes, actually. Gustav, do you want to share any parting thoughts before you go?
Oh, well, as I said in my message, this is a great discussion. I'm sorry I have to leave early. Closing thoughts. As you mentioned earlier that you had kind of prodded me a while ago to just pay extra attention to how is he doing his historical work. Earlier, I made a very appreciative comment. I think in these first 2 chapters, there's not too much to say in terms of, at least from my perspective. Other historians might have other things to say. But from my perspective, I don't have any qualms with the way he's doing. The first chapter is really anecdotal, right? Kind of sets up the things he's taking issue with, how he came to the project. The second chapter is mostly him, laying out Smith, as we know, citing economic textbooks, and then quoting anthropologists. I didn't have any issues with that. One thing, I guess, it's a very small point, is that he talks about the ubiquity of the economic myth, and to beyond all these different textbooks, he says, I also found it, he provides an anecdote about during his anthropological work in Madagascar, and he says, so you see, it is everywhere. And I thought, well, maybe not. But that's all I have to say in terms of critique.
You think he was joking?
Yeah, I couldn't tell if he was actually serious about that little story. It was weird.
Great point.
Dave, just to kind of go off of what Jonathan said, that's kind of what I got when I was reading this, is that, we can, if we want to use some theoretical philosophical tools, you can say that what the myth of barter does is it de-worlds the economy in the Heideggerian sense, right? It's like taking what we experience as a referential entity, a piece of equipment, right? And then de-worlding it into present at hand mode, and then saying, see, this is how it really is, right? It seems that this is what the myth of barter is essentially doing, is de-world and then goes, see, there's the essence of the thing, right? And I think Heidegger kind of can help there with ready-to-hand presence at hand and thinking about that myth.
Yeah, I think that might have been really helpful for 3 or 4 of us here.
Can I jump in really quick?
Yeah.
Just because I'm leaving soon, I'm really interested in that point you made. I have never read Heidegger, unfortunately. Could you say a little bit more about why you think Heidegger is useful?
Sure. Yeah, I'm sorry. Okay, so basically, Heidegger has these 2 ways of saying that we perceive, probably not the word he would choose, the way we interact with things, right? So in our day-to-day life, we just interact with the equipment around us. We just use the door, we go out the door. His famous example is the hammer. Well, the hammer relates to nails relates to the board relates to the hammer, and he calls this referential dimension of pieces of equipment referential totalities, right? And so the idea is that he famously says there's no such thing as a piece of equipment, because when you actually think about equipment, they all exist in networks of equipment. Even something as simple as the chalkboard and the chalk, right? Well, you don't have one without the other. And what philosophers have tended to do is, in kicking back into theoretical contemplative mode, leaving that practical pragmatic mode, they view things as just like physical objects in space. So of course, if you want to view the hammer as a single thing, right, you can kick back and view it as this individual specific entity on its own, but it blinds us to the fact that in our most basic way of experiencing the world, it exists within these networks of referential relations. It's very much like what Saussure thinks of language, that there's no such thing as a sign. Words exist in a complex network, and the value of a word, the meaning of a word, only exists within that set of relations. And so, as like Jonathan was saying, I think this is what he's getting at here, is that if you take the economy, which is ultimately embedded in all of the various aspects of society, and you want to try to isolate it out or de-world it in the Heideggerian sense, then in a sense you've already falsified it in some very fundamental way. And if we start from that isolative perspective, we're going to run into all kinds of problems because it's not going to relate to the world as we actually live it. Hope that helps.
Right. Like if we only think of this object as present at hand, then it's just, then we could just list off its characteristics and stuff like that, right? But we could measure it and we could describe it, but you're missing something if you're also missing the fact that it's like within this referential totality of relations, and that if it was if this appeared in a culture where people had never seen something like this before, it wouldn't make sense. It'd be cut off from its context, right? And so the basic idea is that like there are sciences, or even just like the mere process of systematic thought can sometimes rip things from their contexts, and then you're not making traction with reality anymore, and certain really important things can be lost. Does that make sense?
It did to me for the most part. I think as someone who hasn't read it, I was able to follow, and that was helpful. Unfortunately, I have to go. Thank you all for this wonderful discussion, and hopefully I'll see you again this summer.
Bye, Gustav. So we've got probably about 15 more minutes to talk about this in a structured way. Well, structured meaning like, recording and being live and all that kind of stuff. But afterwards, there'll be more conversation just here, people hanging out afterwards, maybe outside around the fire or what have you. Too bad y'all won't be able to jump in with us. But I know Sam's got something to say, and a couple other people look like they wanted to be able to turn our gaze to some specific passages or questions. But really quick, Robert had something, I believe. I didn't read it, though. I could either read it out loud or you could jump in.
Oh, I just said you could read it. I said what I keep going back to the critique is that I think and I haven't read ahead. I don't know the whole book yet. I just read the first 2 chapters, but I'm wondering if his critique relates to the error of divorcing economics from ethics, and how do we put ethics back into transactions. And then I just pointed out that I always found ceteris paribus to be an absurd basis for an alleged science, because things are never equal, and yet that is the basis of economics.
Oh, wow.
Shots fired.
Words, right?
Well, ceteris paribus.
Yeah,
it's
translation.
All other things being equal. So if you're trying to
isolate it.
if you're trying, it's the isolation, right? If you're trying to isolate what's making the difference in something, you assume everything else is equal, and you try to narrowly focus on one thing, which of course kind of follows the critique. I don't remember who was saying, but the Heideggerian, you miss the whole context of everything else, which to me, that's the question, right? Like in some spheres, it's very helpful to isolate, because there's, in the whole context, the whole social context of a pop can, there's so much going on. You can't do it. It's too sneaking hard. So it can be very helpful to isolate and reduce. But then the question is, are you building back up to something that resembles the actual world, or are you building up to some fantasy, I guess?
How useful is your analysis when you're actually doing
a lot of
things?
Let me take a whack at trying to explain what Graeber's doing by exploding the myth of barter. I do think ceteris paribus can be useful, but that's a topic for another day. I think what Graeber's doing is economists like to say that they've discovered the laws of economics. And the laws of economics operate, according to economists, like any other law. They are, in some sense, irresistible. You can't raise the minimum wage because demand curves for labor slope downward, and that's going to result in more unemployment, et cetera, et cetera. So therefore, let's not go down that policy. So I think what Graeber is doing is he starts from the position that almost all economic textbooks and so forth seem to start with the myth of barter, with the barter story. And this story, at least according to Graeber, and I don't think he's totally fair to Smith or Menger, but this is the way that economies develop. Like, not because of institutions, not because of culture, but because of the irresistible laws of economics. So if Graeber can show that these laws actually don't exist, and that there is no predetermined path that economies have to follow, then suddenly, you can use your imagination to sort of devise whatever economic system, whatever just, fair economic system you want to. You're not bound by what economists call the laws of economics.
So
solid.
Yeah,
that was really helpful.
As I understand it, and sorry, again, I'm trying to address the same kind of what is the point of doing all this. We started with. Sorry if this is an oversimplification of all your great points, but also I see this as like the point of kind of blowing up economics is that in the context of this book, he wants to frame economics as something relational, and he feels that this relational aspect has been taken out of it by like governmental centralization of currency and how debt is inherently relational. So I'm going a bit off the rails here too, but I just want to see your opinions on how you think centralization of currency affects this chapter, this point, or what he's trying to get at in your own words, and also how decentralization of currency would affect these relationships, like how we have blockchain or Bitcoin.
Let me be the first to say, and I would like this to be held on record, I will get it tattooed on my forehead if necessary. I believe Bitcoin will kill us all. And that's not a joke. It will be the death of us.
What?
Look at the power statistics.
Mm-hmm.
But I think...
Oh, you mean in terms of energy consumption to create them?
Yeah. We use more energy to develop to mine Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies than we actually generate in solar power.
Mm-hmm.
But there are other, but to counter that point, there are other cryptocurrencies that could do it better, I guess, right?
Right. There's cryptocurrencies for generating sunlight.
Right?
For generating sunlight. There's.
I know. I'm just saying Bitcoin will kill us.
Oh, okay.
But
I hope it's a bet you're happy to lose. Because if you win it, nobody's gonna be around to pay you.
So I'm starting the queue really quick here. So we're gonna go Athen, and then anyone else want to be on it right now? I know I do. Robert, me. So it goes Athen, Robert, me. Maybe Jonathan, maybe? I'm not sure. Yes, Jonathan. Okay. Anyone else? Sweet. All right. Oh, nice. Mikey, you're on.
Is this kind of he's on, or I'm always first?
No, you're on.
Okay,
Mikey's on the queue.
Okay,
on the queue.
I didn't want to be okay. So this is just kind of a quick jovial point too, but it's not really. It wasn't that important, but okay. Also, not even in terms of just power usage, like energy statistics, but in terms of computation resources that it takes too. Because if our entire monetary system is built upon trying to harvest as much computation as possible, and our society is at this point kind of built on the power of computation, then it's kind of a slippery slope as well. You said Bitcoin will kill us all. So I guess there's multiple avenues you could die.
I know what my first tattoo is.
And Rob, there you go.
Yeah, I did want to build into a broader point responding to you and not just say Bitcoin's going to kill us all. And that I don't think currency at all works. Like I don't want to like get into a broad structural critique of currency. Even Marx would probably frown on that, as Marx himself says that currency is kind of useful for determining, or at least having a way to measure value. But I think though that when we, the reason we have country issued currencies is because we know that currencies are important in controlling economics, and so as long as we have the Westphalian nation state idea, countries are going to issue their own currency because they recognize that they need to have their own way of affecting economic policy, and the easiest way to do that is to have currency. And so moving to decentralization, I'm honestly going to say I don't know if it would be that good. I think that if we look at it economic or environmentally and whatnot, if it's online, it'll probably be very dangerous. If we somehow manage to make a decentralized currency offline, I don't know. Maybe it will be good because it will help break down the Westphalian nation state and the idea that government should be the sole controller of their systems, because that's really what motivates. Current economic policy. Thank you.
Thank you, George. George just got here and brought La Croix.
Yeah, but I think I'll just finish with I don't know if decentralized currency would be better, but I do think it's important to note that the way we definitely think about I can't speak today. Currency about currency now is very harmful in a way.
Word. And you talked about Westphalian nation state. I know some people. I only learned what the what Westphalian even meant like this year. And I was reading Nancy Fraser's Scales of Justice, and the Westphalian nation state is just like the typical presumed sort of framework within which justice unfolds in political theory. I mean, all the way up to like people like Habermas, who are critical theorists, they still were assuming the Westphalian framework, which is that justice happens within the perimeter of a nation state, right? Which makes it really hard to think about justice in regards to refugees, immigrants, undocumented workers, et cetera, et cetera. So, and part of the new left project, and this has been forever, but like is figuring out a way to like go beyond the Westphalian framework in a way that wouldn't be a nightmare, right? So, but there were 2 points that I'm on the queue for that I wanted to bring up. One about Marx and how Marx treated the thought experiment, the state of nature, and why he treated it the way he treated it, because I think Graeber's making a similar maneuver. And the other thing about empire itself, and we haven't really talked a lot about that, right? Why, empire is really not being talked about yet. So that's going to be something awesome to dive into. There's a lot of stuff in here about Haiti and Madagascar and stuff like that. So, but this guy had a thing.
So I accidentally ran ahead, and the next chapter talks a lot about empire and currency, and basically, talks about how currency develops. And I don't remember if it's in this chapter or next chapter because I listened to it all at once on Audible. But he talks about how a lot of other books, when they talk about the history of economics, is actually just a history of coinage, I think is the word that he used. But I'm really excited to talk about more of that next chapter to see what he has to say. I guess I know what he has to say, but
what we have to say about
what you guys have to say about what he has to say. But there's definitely a lot about empire, and he specifically talks a lot about the British Empire, which is really relevant. Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah, so empire. I did want to still say a couple words about that. But maybe I'll actually let other people dig for quotes or passages or pose questions about relation, colonialism in a second. I would rather talk for just a quick second about Marx. So the first time I read Marx was at North Idaho College. A philosophy professor was doing a series of sort of salon events. We'd arranged it on basically Marx's 1844 manuscripts. And I think it's in A Strange Labor, which is one of those. He talks about, he just makes a side comment about the state of nature, which is a thought experiment, that, developed by people like Thomas Hobbes and John Locke and Rousseau, who we just read The Social Contract not too long ago, but like Rousseau's state of nature, right, is like the one of the noble savage. It's like the idea that like, people were like these noble beings before they entered civilization, right? Whereas like someone like Thomas Hobbes thinks that before civilization, life was nasty, brutish, and short. John Locke's kind of in between, right? Like any good British philosopher. But Marx is like, we're not going to talk about the state of nature. It's completely worthless, like to this project. We're not interested in like, oh, how people might have been before entering society. We're interested in like
where they're going,
where we're at now. Why are people dying? Like, why are people like working 17-hour days? Why are children working 17-hour days? What is going on? Why is this being somehow justified by how the social contract works and how we were before this? Who cares, right? Like, that's not going to help us in our analysis about how things are. But the thing is like the state of nature is also a useful thought experiment still. It just depends on what you're trying to do with it. It's still interesting to think about what societies might be like before civilization. One of the problems is that we tend to look at tribes that exist now of people who aren't living in what we call civilization, but like they're not like in the past. They're right now. So actually, like a lot of our assumptions about how people used to be are based off of like how people are now, which is like not necessarily how they were 10,000 years ago or 20,000 years ago, right? So it's good though, like to think about these things, but then it can also be a methodological maneuver to just say, no, we're not using that because that a lot is lost with it, So I think in like a phenomenological sense, like you can take a certain amount of assumptions to be true and then look at things and see something in a certain light, but then you shift out those assumptions for something else and then take a new position on it, right? Which is what I think he gets with anarchism, right? His anarchism puts the state like mainly in focus, right? Whereas if he was more of a socialist, I would think that it would be more about capitalism itself. But he doesn't seem as interested in capitalism because capitalism is really just a way that the state has arranged itself, right? But he doesn't like the state in lots of its arrangements, or at least he's very suspicious in the kind of assumptions and beliefs about how that's justified. Yeah, that was my thoughts on thought experiments in the state of nature. Eddie?
Perhaps I should also mention that there is a kind of justification in page 25, and Smith said that animals cannot trade or cannot exchange things. So this is a justification that human beings are able to exchange things, but it's kind of compromising because it's a tendency to accept that human beings can do that, but can do more than that. So what I see is that Thomas Hobbes also says that he compares human beings with insects, that insects can cooperate and human beings cannot. So in order to create to make human beings to be helpful, they create this Leviathan, this big state, its highest entity that can make people to do things like trade. So they stop thinking because Smith and Hobbes, these thinkers, said that human beings cannot create a new system. I think that's my comment.
Right, and then so Rousseau brings in the examples of living people who were their life is not nasty, brutish, and short, and then says that's actually how it is in the state of nature, right? Which is a powerful argument, you know, before the French Revolution, just to argue like this vast inequality that we're in is totally not what Pacific Islanders are dealing with, right? But then also he kind of just assumes a lot about anthropology in the process, right? And kind of universalizing these things. But yeah, and we had Jonathan and Mikey, and then did anyone else want to be kind of on the last cue here? Just say some words. Cool. So we'll have Benjamin and then Andrew. But Jonathan, you're up.
Okay, so the conversation's shifted a little bit since I went on cue. We were talking about alternative currencies and Bitcoin and all that. So my thoughts on that was I too am a Bitcoin skeptic. Aside from the energy consumption, which I know is a huge thing, but it seems to be based on Austrian economics. Essentially, there's a very commodity-based view of money, but they're trying to simulate it, so they have the mining stuff and all that. I'm more sympathetic to alternative currencies along the lines of Ithaca, New York's LETS system, which is based on Sylvia Gesell's ideas about currency that is sort of self-depreciating because that caused it to circulate. Which I think one thing a lot of Bitcoin defenders talk about. Oh, look how well it's doing. Look how much Bitcoins are worth now. I'm like, well, actually, that's actually not what you want in a currency. You don't want a currency that's going to keep appreciating in value because that causes deflation. It makes it a good investment, but not a good currency, which actually has to circulate and act as a medium for exchange. As far as alternative currencies in general, I think that they're great, but ultimately they're not going to overturn state power because, as David Graeber talked about later, state money, coinage, what have you, is based on the power of taxation. The state issued money circulates because it is owed back to the state in the form of taxes, and therefore is given a value in the market for other goods and services. So until that state monopoly on money is taken over, alternative currency is just going to be a side note. And as far as Rousseau, I think a lot of people might see David Graeber as doing a kind of Rousseauian project here, talking about, people, we once lived in this society of gift economies and primitive communism, as Marx would say it and stuff. But actually, one thing he's talked about a lot in his most recent work is about how societies, it's not that hierarchy is this new thing that emerged in with the agrarian revolution, but that actually societies used to be more flexible. They would come together during certain parts of the period and form these cities and then disperse into these hunter-gatherer societies. And so it's that flexibility, the ability to make and remake society as we wish, that's been lost. And I think that's what he's really trying to get at, is that we have a choice in the social systems we create, and that we can actually be a lot more creative with that than we allow ourselves to be.
Mikey?
Okay, so just a thought moving forward, since I don't know where the argument goes, but as Robert pointed out, I think there is something important to keep our eyes on in relation to morality here, and not to just keep bringing in these complicated ideas from continental philosophers, but Emmanuel Levinas has this distinction between totality and infinity. The point I think we should watch for here is, does debt, when it's functioning in this hyper quantified way, quantifiable debt based on general equivalence, right? Does that intrinsically, structurally, do a violence to each of us as individuals? That if you don't pay the debt, somehow that in and of itself is reducing us to our position in the economy, and it doesn't take into account the fuller range of our being, right? That it's this moment where, oh, you didn't pay your debt, so you're a debtor, you're responsible for that, so you have to face the consequences of that. And it's a kind of violent individualization or isolation of us, and doesn't do justice to the fullness of our, I want to use the word face here, Dave, but do fullness of our individual being. And I'm just wondering if this is where we're going to go with this, is that this type of debt, the way that debt functions in the world that we exist in, is a type of intrinsic violence against each and every one of us.
I'm definitely like thinking the exact same kind of questions with, reading this with Levinas among others, right? Like, yeah, it's definitely.
It essentially feels like debt in and of itself totalizes us, right? It slaps a concept on us as debtor, and it's this great reductionism of us, right? And so
yeah. Your sum worth is this amount, right?
Right, exactly. Like somehow that embodies your being or something. It totalizes it, gives an account of it, whereas it doesn't. Obviously, there's this surplus of being that is the face. And if during your discussion, maybe you can go into this more and explain what I'm trying to say here. But I just think that we should watch for this throughout the book and see how debt in and of itself is performing a sort of violence on us, where it didn't in, say, gift economies, right? That type of indebtedness didn't work in this quantifiable way, and so didn't totalize us.
Right, or at least it wasn't in such a sophisticated, and compounded way.
Yeah, mechanistic way.
Right, yeah, hierarchies everywhere, but there's some that are particularly interesting at the systemic, mass level. So we'll go with Benjamin, and Andrew will get the last word. Really?
What was I going to say? Well, part of it was just that change, and the things that just as kind of a parting thing. The thing that he doesn't say in this, but stood out to me, was almost the exact inverse of this concept of debt being something that actually facilitated trust relationships between people, and they were only able to happen in the context of trust. And basically now there's a backdrop of violence that's making sure that you pay your debts to your fellow people, rather than you're in community with them and you want to repay them. The other thing that I thought of is, debt was kind of good to start off with, and it became bad. And the other thing I thought, if he didn't point this out when he's critiquing, commodities barter, simultaneous exchange barter, talks about it's always in the backdrop of violence between warring factions or whatever. But in some way, that's, at least in the modern world, that's also become the exact opposite thing too, because we don't do a weird dance off with the cashiers. We just hand them money, and it facilitates our daily transactions. It's become a peaceful way of doing business. And it's kind of interesting because, out of that basis of violence, something totally new grew that looks relatively peaceful. And then in the converse, out of debt, which was peaceful and good and helped strengthen social relations and friendships, something, Graeber says, something kind of insidious and bad and violent grew. So each of them kind of became their opposites in a certain way.
So I just want to talk a little bit about how I recently read a book called The Origin of Capitalism by Ellen Meiksins Wood, and it's really interesting how her argument about the origin of capitalism is really similar to the argument that Graeber's been putting about the origin of debt, and it makes sense that debt and capitalism as a history, you can't really separate the two. And it's really interesting because she also talks about the myth of barter and Adam Smith, and she goes back to him, and the assumption under the myth of barter is that there's this natural thing that we're always wanting to do. We're always wanting to turn to our neighbor and get the best of them, right? But obviously, if you look at the history of debt and Graeber's understanding of barter and stuff, like that wasn't the way it was. Like barter was something you did with people you didn't know, right? It's what you did with strangers. And she talks about the same thing, right? Like the original trade networks, right? Like the Dutch, like, you know, like getting something somewhere, shipping it to someone out somewhere else, you know, that wasn't really capitalism. That was just, you know, taking something somewhere and moving it to somewhere else, and then there being a difference in value there. And so it's just going to be really interesting to, you know, I think the change from whatever it was before feudalism to capitalism is what he's talking about here is the moment in which we stop bartering with our with strangers and we start bartering with our familiar, you know, neighbors. And that's like just the biggest change, and that's, you know, his main question. It's like what happens when we start seeing our neighbors as someone to barter with and to like extract value from instead of like someone really far away. So anyway, it's a really the Origin of Capitalism is a really cool book too. And like if you're interested, like there's lots of just like reviews and like and longer essays that she's written that basically give the same point. And I would just suggest if you're interested, it's worth it because it was like really surprising how like well her argument and his argument about the myth of barter line up.
Awesome. Cool. Well, thanks everybody. We will share this the recorded version of this video on in the chat group, but also in the Facebook group. And just so you all realize, there's a difference between the chat and the group. We are a group in the chat, but there's also a Facebook group. And so the Facebook group is where we can kind of have side conversations and develop entire ideas. You know, you can posit a question and people can feed into that. You know, it can be like forums, right? And so I really want to encourage everyone to use that as well as a way of kind of talking outside of the bounds of this room, especially for the people online who can't talk outside around the fire pit. Like this is a good place to share thoughts every once in a while. And then like, yeah. And I said this at the last seminar, encourage people to add one another or like, you know, call one another or like hang out, get coffee, you know, just because it's really helpful to be able to think about these things with other people. And we'll all make friends probably throughout the process of this endeavor. So thank you. Anyone else want to say anything? Brian's saying he doesn't like friends. So. No, leave Bryan alone. Don't. Just kidding.
I'm going to bed.
All right, everybody. Thanks.
Thanks.